Before you get comfortable, take a slow breath, turn the light off, and if you enjoy journeys like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more quiet stories just like it. On a scorching August day in 1578, the young King Sebastian of Portugal rode headlong into enemy lines on a Moroccan battlefield and simply vanished. No body was ever conclusively identified. No grave was ever definitively located. And for nearly 3 centuries afterward, the Portuguese people refused to believe he was dead. This was the greatest military disaster the Portuguese ever suffered in the course of their overseas expansion. The Battle of Alcácer-Quibir, also known as the Battle of Three Kings, claimed not only Sebastian's life but nearly the entire Portuguese nobility. Thousands died or were captured and ransomed at prices that nearly bankrupted the kingdom. Yet from this catastrophe emerged one of history's most persistent conspiracy theories, a messianic belief so powerful it shaped Portuguese politics for generations and even crossed the Atlantic to inspire revolutionary movements in Brazil. Sebastian was born under extraordinary circumstances that seemed to mark him for either greatness or tragedy from his very first breath. His father, Prince João Manuel, died 2 weeks before Sebastian was born on January 20, 1554, making him heir to the Portuguese throne while still in his mother's womb. When his grandfather King John III died in 1557, the 3-year-old child became king of one of the world's most powerful empires. It was a burden no child should bear, and the weight of it would ultimately crush him. The boy's upbringing was entrusted first to his paternal grandmother, Catherine of Austria, a domineering woman who exercised firm control over every aspect of her grandson's life. She was determined to shape him into a ruler worthy of Portugal's imperial glory. But it was the Jesuits who truly formed Sebastian's character, molding him in ways that would prove both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. His tutors included Aleixo de Menezes, a military man of solid reputation, and the priests Luis Goncalves de Câmara and Amador Rebelo. These men instilled in the young king an intense religious devotion that bordered on fanaticism. Contemporaries described Sebastian as tall, slim, and blonde, with great physical strength that made him fearless. As a child he was obedient, but as he grew older he became obstinate and impulsive, traits that his tutors either could not or would not temper. He carried a copy of Thomas Aquinas on a belt at his waist and was constantly accompanied by 2 monks of the Theatine order, who were intent on preserving the king's innocence. This religious intensity shaped every decision he would make as an adult. The Jesuit influence on Sebastian cannot be overstated. During this period, the Society of Jesus held a near monopoly on education in Portugal. They had established colleges throughout the kingdom and wielded enormous influence at the University of Coimbra. The Jesuits saw education as their primary tool for promoting Catholic orthodoxy and combating the Protestant Reformation that was sweeping through northern Europe. In Sebastian, they found an eager pupil, perhaps too eager. The young king absorbed their teachings with such fervor that he came to see himself not merely as a political ruler but as a crusader knight, a new champion of Christendom destined to carry the banner of the faith into the lands of the infidels. This religious worldview was reinforced by the great cultural moment Portugal was experiencing. The poet Luís de Camões had dedicated his epic masterwork Os Lusíadas to King Sebastian, celebrating Portugal's age of discovery and maritime empire. The poem portrayed Portuguese explorers as heroes aided by classical gods, forging a global empire through courage, faith, and maritime prowess. Sebastian grew up surrounded by these narratives of Portuguese exceptionalism, of a small nation chosen by God to spread Christianity to the far corners of the earth. It was intoxicating for a young man with absolute power and unlimited ambition. As Sebastian reached adulthood, marriage became a pressing concern for his advisors. The kingdom needed an heir, and European diplomacy revolved around strategic marriages between royal houses. Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Dowager of France, nurtured a plan to marry her youngest daughter, Margaret of Valois, to Sebastian. It was a match that would have brought Portugal into alliance with France and potentially shifted the balance of power in Europe. But Sebastian himself torpedoed the arrangement. He declared that he was unimpressed by France's mild suppression of the Huguenot Protestants and would not bind himself to the House of Valois until he had seen how religious conflicts there developed. Later, when the Pope's emissaries tried to revive the proposal as a way to prevent Margaret from marrying the Huguenot Henry of Navarre, it was too late. Margaret married Henry in 1572, and Sebastian remained unmarried. Contemporaries noted Sebastian's strange avoidance of women. He would not permit them to touch him, and on several occasions he actively intervened to prevent marriages that had been arranged for him. Some modern historians have speculated about the reasons for this behavior, with theories ranging from religious devotion to possible trauma. One controversial theory suggests he may have contracted a venereal disease as a child, though the evidence for this remains contested. What is clear is that Sebastian's refusal to marry and produce an heir would have catastrophic consequences for Portugal's independence. While Sebastian avoided matrimony, he could not avoid the mounting pressure to assert Portugal's power abroad. By the 1560s and 1570s, Portuguese influence in Morocco was declining. Several way stations along the Moroccan coast that served as ports on the route to India had been lost to local rulers. For a young king raised on stories of crusading glory and Portuguese maritime dominance, this represented an intolerable humiliation. After attaining his majority in 1568, Sebastian dreamed of a great crusade against the Kingdom of Morocco, where he would restore Portuguese prestige and strike a blow for Christendom against Islam. The opportunity came in 1576 when Abu Abdullah Mohammed II Sadi lost his throne in a succession struggle and fled to Portugal. His uncle, Abd al-Malik, had seized power with Ottoman backing. Abu Abdullah asked for Sebastian's help in recovering his throne, and the young king saw his chance for glory. Here was a deposed Muslim ruler asking for Christian assistance, creating the perfect pretext for military intervention. Sebastian began preparing for his crusade with single-minded determination. Not everyone shared the king's enthusiasm. During the Christmastide of 1577, Sebastian met with his uncle King Philip II of Spain at Guadalupe. Philip, who was far more experienced in matters of warfare and diplomacy, tried to dissuade his nephew from the venture. Philip was negotiating a truce with the Ottoman Empire and had no interest in antagonizing the Turks by supporting a military adventure in Morocco. Though he promised a contingent of Spanish volunteers to maintain family ties, Philip refused to commit Spanish resources to what he saw as a foolhardy crusade. Other Portuguese nobles and advisors also counseled caution, pointing out that the kingdom could not afford a major military campaign and that Sebastian had no heir should anything happen to him. But Sebastian would not be deterred. The preparation for the crusade consumed the kingdom's resources. Sebastian assembled an army of approximately 18,000 men, including a significant number of foreign mercenaries hired from the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, Spain, and the Italian states. The force was well equipped with modern weapons including arquebuses and artillery. After haranguing his troops from the windows of the Church of Santa Maria in Lagos, Sebastian departed that port in his armada on June 24, 1578. He landed at Arzelia, one of the few Moroccan ports still in Portuguese hands, where Abu Abdullah joined him with an additional 6,000 Moorish allied troops. Then Sebastian made his fatal error. Rather than establishing a secure base near the coast where his fleet could provide support and supply, he marched his army deep into the Moroccan interior. It was the height of summer, and his heavily armored European troops trudged through scorching heat toward the town of Ksar el-Keba. They were marching to meet Abd al-Malik's much larger army, which included Moroccan cavalry, Ottoman-trained infantry armed with muskets, and artillery. Abd al-Malik's army was partly supplied by the Ottoman Turks and combined Moroccan cavalry with Ottoman musket-armed infantry and cannon. The Portuguese were outnumbered by at least 2-1, possibly 3-1. On August 4, 1578, the two armies met near the Wadi el-Makazin, between the Laucos River and its tributaries. The battle that followed would earn its nickname as the Battle of Three Kings because of the extraordinary fact that all three monarchs present died that day. Sebastian led from the front, displaying the physical courage his tutors had cultivated but none of the tactical wisdom they had failed to instill. The flanks of the Portuguese army began to give way to the Moorish cavalry, and eventually the center became threatened as well. The Portuguese commanders, seeing their flanks collapse and having lost their leader early in the battle, watched as their carefully organized formations disintegrated into chaos. The battle ended after nearly 4 hours of heavy fighting and resulted in the total defeat of the Portuguese and Abu Abdallah's army with 8,000 dead, including the slaughter of almost the whole of the country's nobility and 15,000 taken prisoner. Perhaps only 100 survivors managed to escape to the coast. King Sebastian, who had led a charge into the midst of the enemy and was then cut off from his troops, was never seen again. The Sultan Abd al-Malik also died during the battle, but from natural causes, the effort of riding was too much for him, and the news was concealed from his troops until total victory had been secured. Abu Abdallah, the deposed sultan whom Sebastian had come to restore, drowned trying to flee across the river. 3 kings entered the battle, none survived it. The defeat was so complete, so catastrophic, that it defied comprehension. For Portugal, the battle was an unmitigated disaster, with the captive nobles ransomed, nearly bankrupting Portugal. The kingdom's military power was shattered, its nobility decimated, and its treasury emptied by the ransoms demanded for the surviving prisoners. But even worse than the immediate material losses was the crisis of succession. Sebastian had died at age 24 without an heir, leaving the throne to his aged, childless uncle Henry, a cardinal of the Roman Church. Henry was already in poor health and would reign for less than 2 years, desperately trying to raise the enormous ransoms and stabilize the kingdom. When he died in 1580 without resolving the succession, Portugal's independence died with him. King Philip II of Spain, who had refused to support Sebastian's crusade, now claimed the Portuguese throne as the nearest legitimate relative. A Castilian military invasion crushed resistance from rival claimants, and Portugal was absorbed into what became known as the Iberian Union. For 60 years, from 1580 to 1640, Portugal would be ruled from Madrid, its once proud independence reduced to a mere province of the Spanish Empire. The Portuguese overseas empire, which had stretched from Brazil to India, began a long decline as Spanish priorities took precedence and Portuguese resources were diverted to Spain's endless wars. Yet even as political reality delivered these harsh truths, the Portuguese people began constructing an alternative narrative. How could their desired king, their divinely appointed monarch, have perished so pointlessly in the Moroccan dust? Surely there had been some mistake. Surely he would return. The psychological need for this belief was powerful. Sebastian had been more than just a king, he had been a symbol of Portuguese exceptionalism, the embodiment of the nation's crusading spirit and imperial destiny. Accepting his death meant accepting that Portugal's golden age was over, that the small kingdom would never again stand as one of Europe's great powers. It meant admitting that the crusade had been a terrible mistake, that thousands had died for nothing, and that Portuguese independence was lost because of one young man's reckless ambition. These truths were simply too painful to bear. The absence of Sebastian's body made denial easier. In the chaos and slaughter of the battle, no one could definitively identify the king's remains. Various accounts circulated about what might have happened to him. Some said he had been killed in the initial charge. Others claimed he had been captured and executed. Still others suggested he had somehow escaped the battlefield. Philip II of Spain, eager to legitimize his claim to the Portuguese throne and put an end to uncertainty, eventually produced remains claimed to be Sebastian's. These were ransomed from the Sardians and paraded throughout Portugal in a funeral procession before being buried with royal ceremony at the Jerónimos monastery in Lisbon. But the body was too decomposed for definitive identification, and many Portuguese rejected it as genuine. They wanted to believe that their king still lived, and the absence of conclusive proof allowed them to maintain that hope. The belief gained momentum after an interpretation by priest Antonio Vieira of the second chapter of the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation. Vieira was one of the greatest literary figures in the Portuguese-speaking world, a brilliant Jesuit preacher and writer who had served as confessor to King John IV. In his writings, particularly his Historia do Futuro, Vieira developed an elaborate theological framework for understanding Portugal's destiny. He drew on the prophecies of Goncalo Aines Bandara, a 16th-century cobbler whose verses had circulated widely among the Portuguese people. Bandara's trovas, written decades before Sebastian was even born, spoke in cryptic language of a future Portuguese king who would establish a universal Christian empire. After Sebastian's disappearance, these verses were reinterpreted as referring to him. According to this reading, Sebastian was the hidden one, the encoberto, who would return on a foggy morning to rescue Portugal from its subjugation and lead it to unprecedented glory. The fifth empire he would establish would succeed the four great empires of antiquity, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, and would unite all of humanity under Portuguese spiritual leadership and the temporal authority of a messianic Portuguese monarch. Vieira's theology was sophisticated and drew on deep streams of Christian apocalyptic thought. He argued that Portugal had been chosen by God for this unique mission, that its age of discovery had been merely preparation for its ultimate destiny as the seat of a universal spiritual empire. This empire would not be won through conquest but would emerge through the mysterious workings of divine providence. The king who would lead it might be Sebastian himself, returned from his hidden exile, or it might be another monarch who would fulfill the same prophetic role. These ideas resonated powerfully with Portuguese who lived under Spanish rule. Sebastianism became a form of resistance that could not be easily suppressed. One could not be arrested for hoping that a Portuguese king would return, even if that hope implied rejection of Spanish authority. Speaking of Sebastian's return allowed people to express their longing for independence without directly challenging their Spanish overlords. It transformed political discontent into religious expectation, making it both more powerful and more difficult to control. The ambiguity of Sebastian's fate created an irresistible opportunity for impostors. Since Sebastian's body was never definitively identified after his death, various impostors claimed to be King Sebastian in 1584, 1585, 1595, and 1598. These men understood that there were thousands of Portuguese who desperately wanted to believe their king still lived. Some impostors were cynical opportunists seeking personal gain. Others may have genuinely believed, or convinced themselves, that they were the lost king. The first appeared just 6 years after the battle. He was a commoner from Alcobaça who bore some physical resemblance to Sebastian. When authorities apprehended him, they showed unexpected mercy, sentencing him not to execution but to work as a galley slave. Perhaps they understood that executing the man would make him a martyr and fuel the very beliefs they were trying to suppress. As an anonymous rower on a Spanish galley, he could do no harm, and his claims would gradually be forgotten. Among the most notorious was Marco Tullio Catizone, an Italian from Calabria, who was eventually exposed and hanged in 1603. Catizone initially denied any royal claims, but he eventually consented to the acclamations of local peasants who were convinced he was their lost king. The spectacle of his exposure and execution was designed to humiliate him and discredit Sebastianism itself. He was paraded through Lisbon streets on a donkey, subjected to the jeers of crowds who had once believed in him, and publicly hanged. Yet even this degrading spectacle failed to kill the legend. A third impostor arose from an unlikely collaboration between Miguel dos Santos, an Augustinian friar who had once been Sebastian's chaplain, and Gabriel de Espinosa, a baker. Dos Santos, who had actually known the real Sebastian, persuaded Espinosa to impersonate the king. They even gained the support of Maria Anna de Austria, a nun who was Sebastian's cousin. The conspiracy was eventually discovered, both men were forced to confess under torture, and they were hanged. The involvement of a man who had personally known Sebastian added a bizarre authenticity to this particular fraud. If Sebastian's own former chaplain believed the baker could be the king, what did that say about the original identification of Sebastian's body? A fourth pretender emerged in Naples but undermined his own claims by his inability to speak Portuguese. Each impostor, rather than discrediting Sebastianism, seemed to reinforce it. If men were willing to risk their lives claiming to be Sebastian, perhaps that meant the true king really could return. Perhaps the next claimant would be genuine. The authorities faced a dilemma. Executing impostors made them martyrs, but allowing them to live gave them platforms to spread their claims. In either case, Sebastianism persisted and grew. The most intellectually sophisticated defense of Sebastianism came from Dom João de Castro, a supporter of Antonio, prior of Crato, who had fought against Philip II's seizure of the Portuguese throne. Writing from exile in Paris between the late 16th century and 1623, Dom João produced 3 published books and over 20 manuscript volumes arguing for Sebastian's eventual return. He identified Sebastian with Bandara's Hidden One and drew elaborate connections between biblical prophecy and Portuguese history. His writings portrayed the Fifth Empire as both a political and spiritual reality, a fusion of temporal power and divine purpose that would transform human civilization. According to Dom João's interpretation, the 60 years of Spanish rule were not a defeat but a test, a period of purification necessary before Portugal could fulfill its destiny. Sebastian's disappearance was not death but concealment, a strategic withdrawal until the appointed time. The king lived in hiding, perhaps on a remote island, perhaps in a monastery, perhaps in some mystical realm between earth and heaven, waiting for the moment when God would reveal him and commission him to establish the Fifth Empire. Every setback, every year that passed without his return, could be reinterpreted as part of the divine plan, another stage in Portugal's preparation for its ultimate triumph. These ideas proved especially popular among Portugal's new Christians, the Jews who had been forced to convert to Catholicism in the late 15th century. Many of these families maintained their Jewish identity in secret while outwardly conforming to Christian practice. Sebastianism, with its emphasis on a hidden Messiah and a future age of justice, resonated with Jewish messianic traditions. The Fifth Empire could be understood as a kind of Christian version of the Messianic age described in Jewish prophecy. New Christians could embrace Sebastianism as a way of expressing both their Portuguese patriotism and their deeper spiritual longings. The Catholic Church viewed this development with deep suspicion. The Inquisition actively sought to confiscate writings associated with the belief and prosecuted its most vocal proponents. Antonio Vieira himself, despite being a Jesuit priest of impeccable orthodoxy, fell afoul of the Inquisition. He was arrested and imprisoned from 1665 to 1667, and finally imposed a sentence which prohibited him from teaching, writing, or preaching. The charges against him were vague but serious, promoting heretical prophecies, encouraging Jewish messianism, and undermining the established order. The Inquisition understood that Sebastianism, whatever its religious trappings, was fundamentally a challenge to Spanish authority and potentially to the Catholic Church's monopoly on defining Orthodox belief. Yet suppression only drove Sebastianism underground, where it evolved and spread through oral tradition and clandestinely copied manuscripts. Bandara's verses remained in circulation as a popular form of folk literature. New editions appeared periodically, sometimes published abroad and smuggled into Portugal. Each new crisis in Portuguese history, military defeats, economic hardships, natural disasters, prompted a revival of Sebastianist hopes. If the present was unbearable, then the future must bring salvation. If human efforts had failed, then divine intervention would surely come. In 1640, Portugal finally revolted against Spanish rule and established the Braganza dynasty under King John IV. This should have ended Sebastianism, since Portuguese independence had been restored and a legitimate monarch ruled from Lisbon. Yet the belief persisted in altered form. King John IV had to swear to yield his throne to Sebastian, who would have been 86 years old by that point. The gesture was both absurd and revealing. No one seriously believed that the aged king would actually appear to claim his throne, yet John IV felt compelled to make the oath anyway. It demonstrated how thoroughly Sebastianism had penetrated Portuguese political consciousness. A king could not simply ignore the myth, he had to acknowledge it, co-opt it, or work within its symbolic framework. After the Lisbon earthquake struck on All Saints' Day in 1755, there was a surge of converts to Sebastianism. The earthquake, which killed tens of thousands and destroyed much of Lisbon, was interpreted as another sign that the present age was ending and the Fifth Empire would soon begin. Natural disasters often fuel millenarian movements by making the existing order seem fragile and demonstrating the need for divine intervention. In the rubble of Lisbon, Sebastianist preachers found eager audiences. The most severe blow to Sebastianism came during the premiership of the Marquis of Pombal in the mid-18th century. Pombal was a reformer who sought to modernize Portugal and break the power of what he saw as reactionary forces, particularly the Jesuits. He blamed the Jesuits for promoting Sebastianism and using banderas prophesied to maintain their influence. As part of his campaign against the Jesuits, Pombal violently persecuted Sebastianists and expelled the Jesuits from Portugal in 1759. The Inquisition arrested and prosecuted those who propagated Sebastianist ideas. Yet even Pombal's ruthless campaign could not eradicate the belief entirely. It had sunk too deep into Portuguese culture, become too intertwined with national identity. During the Napoleonic Wars, when French forces occupied Portugal, Sebastianism experienced yet another revival. The occupation sparked Portuguese nationalism, and with nationalism came renewed interest in the myths and legends that defined Portuguese identity. If Portugal was once again oppressed by a foreign power, might not the Hidden One finally return to liberate his people? By the 19th century, even as Portugal entered the modern era, Sebastianism had become a permanent fixture of Portuguese cultural life. Intellectuals began using the term Sebastianist as a critique of what they saw as a national character flaw, the tendency to wait passively for miraculous salvation instead of taking practical action to solve problems. To call someone Sebastianist was to accuse them of living in dreams and prophesies rather than engaging with reality. The Portuguese word saudade, that untranslatable sense of melancholic longing for something lost or absent, became associated with Sebastianism. Both reflected a national psychology shaped by centuries of decline, a people who had once been at the center of global history but now found themselves on Europe's periphery. Yet Sebastianism proved remarkably portable. When Portuguese colonists and their descendants established communities in Brazil, they brought the myth with them. In the vast interior of Brazil, particularly in the impoverished northeast, Sebastianism took on new forms among populations that had never seen Portugal. The belief evolved to fit Brazilian circumstances, blending with local folk traditions and indigenous spiritual practices. By the late 19th century, a man named Antonio Vicente Mendes Maciel, known as Antonio Conselheiro, began rising to prominence in Bahia's hinterlands. Conselheiro was one of many itinerant religious figures who wandered the Brazilian backlands preaching to the poor. He traveled from village to village with his followers, assisting local communities and garnering support from small farmers, collecting money and organizing labor for the construction of churches, dams and cemeteries. As his following grew, Conselheiro drew the attention and hostility of local landowners who saw him as a threat to their control over labor and land. Conselheiro claimed to be a prophet and predicted the return of the legendary Portuguese King Sebastian. In his preaching, Sebastian was no longer a specifically Portuguese figure but a universal savior who would restore divine monarchy and protect Catholicism. This message resonated powerfully in the Brazilian Sertão, where life was brutally hard and the distant Republican government in Rio de Janeiro seemed indifferent to rural suffering. The proclamation of Brazil as a republic in 1889 had created deep anxiety in the countryside. The republic separated church and state, abolished civil recognition of religious marriages, and introduced new taxes and bureaucratic requirements that rural Brazilians found bewildering and oppressive. For many peasants, the greatest change was spiritual. They now lived under what they perceived as a godless government. Conselheiro preached that the republic was the work of the Antichrist, that its laws were the law of the hound, and that only a divinely appointed monarch could provide legitimate rule. In 1893, Conselheiro and his followers established a permanent settlement at an abandoned farm called Canudos in the remote interior of Bahia. He established a communitarian society with division of labor and produce, common property, abolition of civil marriage and official currency, prohibition of taverns, liquor and prostitution, rigid control over crimes and mandatory religious activities. The settlement grew rapidly, attracting former slaves, landless peasants, small farmers, and even outlaws seeking refuge. At its height, Canudos may have housed as many as 30,000 people, making it one of the largest communities in the region. The existence of Canudos alarmed Brazilian authorities. Here was a settlement that rejected the Republic's authority, refused to pay taxes, maintained its own armed militia, and explicitly awaited a prophesied king who would overthrow the government. Antonio Conselheiro and his followers were branded as monarchists by the press, with authorities seeing the settlement as a threat to the recently proclaimed Brazilian Republic. When a dispute over lumber delivery led to fears that Canudos residents would march on a neighboring town, the state governor requested military intervention. What followed was one of the most shameful episodes in Brazilian military history. The government sent for successive military expeditions against Canudos between 1896 and 1897. The first three were defeated by the settlement's defenders, who fought with desperate courage using primitive weapons against modern rifles and artillery. The defeat shocked the Brazilian public and government. How could a rabble of peasants, armed with little more than machetes and faith, defeat the national army? The fourth and final expedition, led by General Arthur Oscar, deployed a large fraction of the Brazilian army. They surrounded Canudos, cut off its water and supply lines, and subjected it to constant bombardment. During the heavy military siege, Antonio Conselheiro spent his time praying and fasting, troubled by the death, hunger, and suffering of his followers. He died of dysentery on September 22, 1897, 2 weeks before the final assault. The conflict came to a brutal end in October 1897, when the settlement was overrun. The defenders fought to the last, refusing to surrender. The army showed no mercy. At least 15,000 people were killed, many of them after their capture. The soldiers went house to house, killing everyone they found. They exhumed Conselheiro's corpse, photographed it, and decapitated it. His head was taken to the coast as a trophy, then to the medical school in Salvador, where his brain was studied by scientists seeking to understand what they assumed was his obvious insanity. Finally, the army burned Canudos to the ground, fulfilling their orders that stone should not remain upon stone. The War of Canudos became a defining moment in Brazilian national consciousness, much as the Battle of Alcácer Quibir had been for Portugal. The journalist Euclides da Cunha, who covered the final campaign, wrote an epic account called Os Sertões, Rebellion in the Backlands, that wrestled with the meaning of what had happened. Da Cunha portrayed the people of Canudos not as fanatics or rebels but as victims of a society that had abandoned them, people who had created their own alternative world because the official world offered them nothing but exploitation and misery. His book became a classic of Brazilian literature and forced educated Brazilians to confront their treatment of the rural poor. Sebastianism, transplanted from Portugal to Brazil and transformed by local conditions, had inspired one of the deadliest conflicts in Brazilian history. The myth that began with a Portuguese king lost on a Moroccan battlefield had, 3 centuries later, led thousands of Brazilian peasants to their deaths in the northeastern backlands. The specific form of the belief had changed. Conselheiro's followers were not waiting for Sebastian himself but for a Sebastian-like figure who would restore divine monarchy. But the underlying psychology remained the same, the conviction that miraculous salvation was imminent, that present suffering was temporary, that a hidden king would return to establish a just order. Back in Portugal, Sebastianism continued to evolve through the 20th century. The concept was repopularized with the publication of Mensagem by Fernando Pessoa in 1934. Pessoa, generally considered Portugal's greatest modern writer, reimagined Sebastianism for the modern era. His epic poem Mensagem is a meditation on Portuguese history and identity structured around mystical and prophetic themes. The work is divided into 3 cycles: Braçal, coat of arms, which celebrates Portugal's historical heroes, Mar Portugues, Portuguese Sea, which commemorates the Age of Discovery, and O Encoberto, the Hidden One, which looks forward to the Fifth Empire. In Pessoa's vision, the Fifth Empire would be spiritual rather than material, achieved through cultural and intellectual influence rather than military conquest. The Fifth Empire would not be a mere territorial empire but a spiritual and linguistic body spreading throughout the entire world, representing the ultimate fusion between material knowledge and spiritual wisdom. Pessoa suggested that Portugal's true destiny lay not in recovering past glories but in exercising a different kind of power, the power of language, literature, and philosophy. The Hidden One would not be a conquering king but perhaps a poet or philosopher, someone who would unite humanity through ideas rather than armies. Pessoa himself saw his role as that of a cultural messiah, a supracamos who would complete the work begun by Portugal's earlier national poet. He engaged deeply with occult traditions including Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, and Templar symbolism, weaving these elements into his elaborate mythology of Portuguese destiny. His concept of the Fifth Empire drew on Antonio Vieira's prophetic writings and Bandara's medieval verses, but Pessoa transformed these sources into something distinctly modern, a vision of cultural imperialism rather than political domination, of Portugal exercising influence through its language and literature rather than through military might. The publication of Mensagem in 1934 coincided with the rise of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's Estado Novo regime in Portugal. Salazar's authoritarian government promoted Portuguese nationalism and imperial nostalgia as part of its ideology. The regime awarded Mensagem first prize in a literary competition organized by its propaganda department, seeing in Pessoa's mystical nationalism something compatible with its own political project. Yet Pessoa's vision was ultimately incompatible with Salazar's narrow authoritarianism. Pessoa imagined a Portugal that would influence the world through culture and spirit, while Salazar sought merely to preserve Portugal's African colonies and maintain rigid control over society. The Fifth Empire Pessoa envisioned was cosmopolitan and universalist. Salazar's vision was defensive and isolationist. Through Mensagem and Pessoa's other writings on Sebastianism, the myth took on yet another form. It was no longer primarily about a literal king returning to restore monarchy. It had become a metaphor for Portugal's potential to contribute to human civilization despite its small size and peripheral location. The Hidden One might be Portugal itself, a nation whose greatest achievements lay not in past conquests but in future cultural influence. This intellectual version of Sebastianism acknowledged Portugal's decline as a political and military power while asserting its continued relevance in realms of the spirit and imagination. Today, King Sebastian's disappearance remains a cornerstone of Portuguese cultural identity. The architectural landscape of Lisbon still bears witness to the myth. The Case das Colunas, the key of the columns near the city's main square, stands as the symbolic gateway through which Sebastianists believed their king would make his triumphant return. The two pillars marking the threshold between sea and land represent the boundary between present loss and future restoration. Tourists who visit Lisbon rarely understand the significance of these columns, but for generations of Portuguese they represented hope itself, the place where the Hidden One would finally step ashore to reclaim his kingdom. The Geronimo's monastery, where Sebastian's supposed remains were buried, became another site of pilgrimage and contemplation. The elaborate tomb, commissioned by Philip II and later enhanced by Portuguese monarchs, tells its own story of political manipulation and national longing. The body placed there may or may not have been Sebastian's. Doubt persisted for centuries, but the tomb served its purpose as a site where the nation could process its grief and maintain its connection to the lost king. The monastery itself, built to commemorate Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, symbolized Portugal's maritime glory, making it the perfect resting place for the king who had tried and failed to extend that glory through crusade. Portuguese literature has returned to Sebastian again and again. Besides Pessoa's Mensagem, the myth appears in countless poems, novels, and plays. The 20th century writer José Saramago, Portugal's only Nobel Prize winner for literature, explored themes of messianic expectation and popular delusion in works like Memorial do Convento. While not directly about Sebastian, these works engage with the same questions that Sebastianism raises. Why do people invest their hopes in savior figures? How do myths shape political reality? What happens when collective dreams collide with individual suffering? Even Portuguese popular music has incorporated Sebastianist themes. Fado, the melancholic musical style that emerged in Lisbon in the early 19th century, often explores themes of saudade, loss, and longing that connect directly to the Sebastianist mentality. Famous Fado singers like Amália Rodrigues performed songs that referenced the Hidden One and the dream of his return, using the myth as a metaphor for personal and collective yearning. The minor keys and plaintive vocals of Fado capture something essential about the emotional landscape that Sebastianism created, a permanent state of mourning combined with impossible hope. No serious historian today believes Sebastian survived the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. Despite the lack of a body that could be conclusively identified at the time, Sebastian was presumed dead at the age of 24. The balance of evidence strongly suggests he died on the battlefield, either killed in the initial fighting or executed shortly after being captured. The body Philip II produced and buried in Lisbon may well have been genuine, though decay and the passage of time made absolute verification impossible. Even if it was not Sebastian's body, the real Sebastian was certainly dead by the time it was interred. Yet the power of the myth persists not because people believe in its literal truth, but because it captures something essential about the human response to unbearable loss. Sebastianism represents one of history's most elaborate and prolonged exercises in collective denial, a refusal to accept reality that lasted for centuries and spread across an ocean. The Portuguese created an entire theology, politics, and cultural identity around the belief that their lost king would return, and they maintained that belief long after it had any connection to plausible fact. The psychology behind Sebastianism reveals patterns that recur throughout human history. When a society experiences catastrophic loss, when the foundations of collective identity are shattered, people will construct alternative narratives that make the unbearable bearable. Sometimes these narratives take the form of conspiracy theories. Powerful forces secretly arranged the disaster, which means it was not inevitable and might be reversed. Sometimes they take the form of messianic expectations. The disaster was prophesied, which means it has meaning, and the prophecies also promise eventual redemption. Sometimes they combine both elements, as Sebastianism did. The ambiguity surrounding Sebastian's fate was crucial to the myth's longevity. If his body had been definitively identified on the battlefield, if Philip II had been able to display the corpse in a way that left no doubt, Sebastianism might never have emerged. The absence of certainty created space for alternative interpretations, and people desperate for hope filled that space with their dreams. This pattern appears throughout history. Conspiracy theories and messianic movements thrive where evidence is ambiguous and official accounts are distrusted. The role of prophecy in sustaining Sebastianism also reveals something about how belief systems maintain themselves against contrary evidence. Bandara's verses were sufficiently vague that they could be continuously reinterpreted to fit changing circumstances. When Sebastian failed to return in 1600, Sebastianists could claim the prophecies referred to 1640. When 1640 came and Sebastian still did not appear, the prophecies could be reinterpreted as referring to the restoration of Portuguese independence, which did occur that year. When independence was restored but the Fifth Empire did not materialize, the prophecies could be reimagined as spiritual rather than temporal. This flexibility is characteristic of successful prophetic traditions. They make predictions that are either unfalsifiable or can be endlessly reinterpreted. The class dimensions of Sebastianism also deserve attention. The myth was not uniformly believed across Portuguese society. The educated elite, particularly by the 18th century, tended to view Sebastianism with skepticism or outright derision. It was primarily among the common people, peasants, artisans, the urban poor, that the belief remained strong. This class division appears clearly in the Brazilian case, where Canudos was populated by the rural poor while coastal elites viewed it with contempt and fear. Sebastianism became, in part, a form of class resistance, allowing the powerless to imagine a future where their oppressors would be overthrown and divine justice would prevail. The impostors who periodically claim to be Sebastian illustrate another dimension of the myth's social function. These men, whether cynical frauds or self-deluded believers, provided focal points for discontent. When an impostor appeared, people could rally around him, express their dissatisfaction with current rulers, and briefly imagine that change was possible. The authorities understood this, which is why impostors were treated so harshly. They were not just individual criminals but threats to political stability, human embodiments of an alternative legitimacy that challenged the established order. Antonio Vieira's sophisticated theological defense of Sebastianism shows how educated elites could engage with the myth while reinterpreting it in ways that served their purposes. Vieira's Fifth Empire was not a simple restoration of Portuguese monarchy but a complex vision of universal Christian civilization under Portuguese spiritual leadership. He could be a loyal subject of the Braganza dynasty while simultaneously promoting ideas that seem to imply that dynasty's eventual displacement. This intellectual version of Sebastianism was more respectable than folk beliefs in Sebastian's literal return, but it preserved the core conviction that Portugal had a special destiny and that current reality did not represent the final word on Portuguese history. The Inquisition's persecution of Sebastianists reveals the Catholic Church's ambivalence about the movement. On one hand, Sebastianism was rooted in Christian apocalyptic tradition and expressed itself through Christian symbols and expectations. On the other hand, it threatened ecclesiastical authority by promoting prophetic interpretations that had not been officially sanctioned and by creating expectations of imminent transformation that could destabilize society. The Inquisition was particularly concerned about the appeal of Sebastianism to new Christians, suspecting that crypto-Jews were using Christian messianic language to express Jewish hopes. This suspicion was not entirely unfounded. The convergence between Sebastianist expectations of the Fifth Empire and Jewish hopes for the Messianic age was real enough to create theological problems for the Church. The migration of Sebastianism to Brazil and its transformation there demonstrates the myth's adaptability. The Brazilian version emerged in a completely different context from the original Portuguese belief. Brazilian Sebastianists were not waiting for their lost king to return but for a messianic figure to overthrow an alien government and restore what they understood as legitimate, divinely sanctioned order. The myth had been stripped of its specifically Portuguese national content and reduced to its essential elements: expectation of a hidden savior, rejection of present authority, hope for imminent transformation. This shows that Sebastianism was, at its core, not really about Sebastian at all but about a certain structure of belief that could attach itself to different historical circumstances. The Canudos conflict had lasting effects on Brazilian politics and culture. The settlement became a symbol of rural resistance to coastal modernization, of traditional religious communities confronting secular government, of the poor creating alternative societies when official society failed them. The brutal suppression of Canudos became a source of national shame, forcing Brazilians to confront the violence embedded in their state's formation and the gulf between coastal elites and interior populations. The comparison to the original Portuguese Sebastianism is instructive. In both cases, the myth arose among people who felt abandoned by their rulers, who saw their traditional way of life threatened, and who yearned for a miraculous restoration of an imagined past where life had meaning and authority was legitimate. Fernando Pessoa's modernist reinterpretation of Sebastianism in the 20th century represents yet another transformation. Pessoa took a myth that had been about military conquest and political restoration and reimagined it as cultural and spiritual mission. His fifth empire would be achieved not through armies but through poetry, philosophy, and the Portuguese language. This intellectual transformation reflected Portugal's changed circumstances in the modern world. By Pessoa's time, Portugal could not realistically aspire to political or military greatness. Its empire was crumbling, its economy was backward, and its government was increasingly authoritarian and isolated. But Pessoa suggested that political decline need not mean cultural irrelevance, that a small nation could still contribute something significant to human civilization through its spiritual and artistic achievements. This reading of Sebastianism has influenced how contemporary Portuguese understand their nation's place in the world. Portugal today is a small country on Europe's periphery, no longer a great power, its empire gone. Yet there remains a sense, particularly in cultural circles, that Portugal has something unique to offer, some special quality rooted in its history of maritime exploration, its experience of decline, and its particular form of melancholy. The concept of saudade, which foreigners find impossible to translate, becomes a source of national pride. Only the Portuguese truly understand this emotion, and through their literature and music they can communicate it to the world. This is Pessoa's fifth empire realized in modest form, not a political conquest but a cultural export, Portugal influencing others through what makes it distinctively Portuguese. The myth of King Sebastian ultimately tells us more about the Portuguese people than about the king himself. Sebastian was, by most accounts, a mediocre ruler whose religious fanaticism and lack of political judgment led to catastrophic defeat. He had no particular qualities that should have made him an object of such prolonged veneration. What made him a figure of myth was not who he was but what his disappearance represented. The end of Portuguese greatness, the loss of independence, the collapse of imperial dreams. In mourning Sebastian, the Portuguese were really mourning themselves, their vanished glory, their reduced circumstances. For nearly 3 centuries, Portuguese people gazed toward Morocco on foggy mornings, half expecting to see their lost king emerging from the mist to reclaim his throne and restore their nation to greatness. They never saw him, of course. No hidden one appeared at the Cais das Colunas. No fifth empire materialized. The prophecies went unfulfilled, at least in any literal sense. But the very act of looking, of maintaining hope against all evidence, served a purpose. It allowed a people to endure occupation, decline, and humiliation without losing their sense of identity. It gave them a story to tell about themselves that was more bearable than the truth. The impostors are long dead, their frauds exposed and their bodies buried in anonymous graves. The sophisticated theological justifications for Sebastianism have been forgotten except by specialists in Portuguese intellectual history. The peasants of Canudos who waited for their messianic king are dust in the Brazilian sertão. Portugal has moved forward into modernity, a democratic republic integrated into the European Union, its imperial past increasingly distant. Yet the memory of the hidden king endures in the nation's literature, music, and collective consciousness, not as belief but as metaphor, not as history but as myth. The story of King Sebastian remains relevant because it captures a universal human tendency. When confronted with unbearable loss, we construct alternative narratives. When present reality seems intolerable, we project our hopes onto an imagined future. When we lack the power to change our circumstances, we wait for miraculous intervention. These responses are not unique to 16th century Portuguese. They appear throughout human history and across all cultures. What makes Sebastianism remarkable is not its psychology but its scale and longevity, the way our entire nation sustained a collective fantasy for so long, and how that fantasy continued to inspire belief and action even centuries after its original context had vanished. In the end, Sebastianism teaches us that the line between historical truth and cultural myth is never as clear as we might wish. What matters is not just what actually happened but what people believe happened and what stories they tell to make sense of their experience. King Sebastian died at Alcácer Quibir in 1578. Almost certainly cut down in the chaos of battle or executed shortly after. But in another sense, he never died at all. He lives on in Portuguese consciousness, in the melancholy of fado songs, in the mystical nationalism of Pessoa's poetry, in the way the Portuguese understand their own national character. The conspiracy theory was false, but the cultural truth it expressed was real, that some losses are so profound people would rather believe in fairy tales than accept reality, and sometimes, in the strangest alchemy of history, those fairy tales become as influential as any truth. In the end, Sebastianism reminds us that myths can linger longer than kings. Some losses carve such deep shadows that the stories we create to survive them become a truth all their own.